Tonight, we journey into the extraordinary mind of George Orwell, the writer who saw through the shadows of totalitarianism before they fully descended upon the world. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find value in these philosophical journeys into wisdom that can guide our modern lives. Let me know in the comments where you're joining us from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, perhaps light a candle, and let's ease into tonight's philosophical journey together. In 1910, in the quiet village of Shiplake, a young Eric Blair stood on his head in a field, an early instinct to challenge ordinary perspectives. Picture this moment with me, a small boy, deliberately flipping himself upside down, seeking perhaps a different view of the English countryside that surrounded him. This wasn't mere childlike playfulness. It was an instinct that would define his entire life's work, the need to question what everyone else accepted as normal. This scene captures something profound about the childhood that would shape one of the 20th century's most penetrating minds. Eric Blair, who would later choose the pen name George Orwell, was born into a world of rigid class distinctions in colonial Britain. His family straddled that uncomfortable space between the working class they came from and the middle-class aspirations they sought to embrace. This liminal position, belonging fully to neither world, created in young Eric a persistent sense of not quite fitting in. Yet this discomfort, instead of crushing his spirit, sharpened his perception. Standing on his head in that field was his first conscious act of seeing the familiar from an unfamiliar angle. He was learning to question the assumptions that most people never examine, like the assumption that the way we see things is the only way to see them. And here we encounter something remarkably relevant to our own time. Today, when many feel pressured to conform to digital and social expectations, this instinct remains vital. Consider how social media platforms design their interfaces to reward conformity. The algorithms that prioritize popular opinions, the pressure to curate perfect online personas, the subtle ways our feeds shape what we think we want and believe. The young Orwell's instinct to challenge ordinary perspectives becomes a guide for navigating our modern landscape of carefully constructed viewpoints. Just as he turned himself upside down in that field, we might ask ourselves, what assumptions am I accepting without examination? What perspectives am I never even considering? Viewers can apply this by gently questioning the unspoken norms shaping their own daily choices. Not with aggressive skepticism that destroys everything, but with the curious courage of a child willing to see familiar things in unfamiliar ways. As we begin our philosophical journey together, let us carry with us the image of that young boy in Shiplake, upside down in a field, already teaching us that the first step toward wisdom is often the simplest. Deciding to look at the world differently than everyone else expects us to. Let this thought linger softly as we prepare to journey deeper into Orwell's formative years. In the strict halls of St. Cyprian's, Orwell experienced a harsh inequality that revealed how power silently shapes young minds. Picture, if you will, a boy of 8 standing in the corridors of this boarding school in Eastbourne, England, in the autumn of 1911. Eric Blair had won a scholarship to this prestigious institution through his mother's connections, but he soon discovered that scholarship students inhabited a different world entirely from the paying pupils. The other boys came from wealthy families, their term fees paid without question, while Blair's reduced rates came with a quietly acknowledged shame. And in this daily reality of second-class citizenship, written in subtle gestures and overheard whispers, the young Blair began to understand something profound about how societies maintain their hierarchies. The school environment became a training ground for observing injustice. St. Cyprian's wasn't overtly cruel. It was worse than that. It was civilized in its cruelty, refined in its discrimination. The headmaster and his wife maintained a veneer of respectability while perpetuating a system of obvious inequality. Scholarship students like Blair were given the worst rooms, the hand-me-down uniforms, the cold stares from staff who knew exactly where each boy belonged in the social pecking order. This wasn't the raw brutality that might forge a simple hatred. It was something far more insidious. It was injustice dressed in good manners, cruelty wrapped in educational virtue. Here, Orwell learned to read the language of power that hides behind smiles and proper diction. From this, Orwell formed his lifelong suspicion of systems that mask cruelty behind civility. The lessons of St. Cyprian's would echo throughout every major work he would later create. In Animal Farm, when the pigs gradually transform their privileges into rights while maintaining their moral authority, we hear the quiet voice of that scholarship boy who watched civilized men rationalize inequality. In 1984, when Big Brother's oppression comes wrapped in slogans about love and security, we recognize the same pattern, power disguising itself as beneficence. Modern institutions, from workplaces to online platforms, still echo these dynamics. The subtle hierarchies Blair first noticed in 1911 continue to shape how we move through the world today. The corporate ladder that rewards conformity, the social media algorithms that manipulate engagement, the political rhetoric that masks self-interest in appeals to tradition and order, and so we can gently turn our attention to our own lives. Applying Orwell's insight begins with noticing where subtle hierarchies influence your behavior, where the language of civility might be hiding the language of control. In this awareness, we find the first seeds of true freedom. Freedom to see power clearly, even when it wears a smile and speaks in whispers. Let that thought settle as we continue our exploration. What if belonging always came with a quiet cost? This is the profound question that young Eric Blair would carry with him long after his school years ended. At just 8 years old, Blair found himself at St. Cyprian's not as a full-paying student, but as what we might today call a scholarship boy. His family, what he described as lower upper middle class, simply could not afford the full fees of a proper English public school education. And so, with reduced fees came reduced status. He was, as he later wrote, like a goldfish thrown into a tank full of pike, surrounded by classmates whose families could afford what his could not, constantly aware of the invisible boundaries that money creates, even among children. The psychological weight of this experience was immense. Blair writes in his essay, such were the joys that St. Cyprian's was a world of force and fraud and secrecy, where virtue consisted in being bigger, stronger, handsomer, richer, more popular, more elegant, more unscrupulous than other people. Here was an 8-year-old boy, already acutely aware that his presence was conditional, that he was valued not for who he was, but for what he might achieve for the school's prestige. This was not merely about wealth, it was about the quiet, constant negotiation of belonging that comes with being the other. Yet this painful awareness of social stratification would become the foundation for one of the most important bodies of political writing in the 20th century. Blair's experience at St. Cyprian's taught him something that perhaps no book or lecture could have, that oppression often wears the mask of normalcy, that power secures itself not just through force, but through the slow erosion of a person's sense of rightful place in the world. Today, we might recognize this same dynamic in countless environments where status silently informs opportunity. The scholarship student in an elite university, the first-generation college graduate in a corporate boardroom, the person navigating spaces that were never designed with people like them in mind, all navigate the complex terrain that Blair first mapped as a child. The question is not merely about overt discrimination, but about the subtle ways that institutions teach people to question their rightful place, to be grateful for inclusion rather than to expect equity. Blair's experience reminds us that the burden of the scholarship boy is not simply the pressure of academic performance, but the psychological work of maintaining dignity in spaces that subtly suggest you don't quite belong. Yet in that burden, in that constant awareness of the social architecture around us, lies also a gift, the ability to see what others might miss, to recognize the invisible structures that shape our lives. It was this gift, born from childhood suffering, that would later enable one of the most important voices for freedom and truth in the modern age. Let this understanding rest gently with you as we prepare to explore further into Orwell's journey. In early childhood, Orwell rarely saw his father, a figure whose authority was present yet distant. This absence shaped Orwell's awareness of hierarchical power embodied in both people and institutions. Imagine for a moment what it means for a child to know authority only as an abstraction, to understand power through its absence rather than its presence. The young Eric Blair learned this lesson through a father who existed in letters, in the occasional brief visit, in the family's financial support, all the external markers of paternal responsibility, yet warmth, mentorship, and daily guidance remained mysteriously absent. His father, Richard Blair, serving in the distant bureaucracy of British colonial administration, embodied power that was real yet inaccessible. This paradox of authority, simultaneously powerful and unreachable, became Orwell's first encounter with power that functioned without genuine human engagement. Authority without warmth becomes something abstract, something that exists not through relationship but through position alone. This early experience planted seeds of a profound question that would echo throughout Orwell's later writings. How do we recognize authentic authority when it comes divorced from human connection? Years later, when he witnessed totalitarian systems that governed through fear and surveillance rather than care and connection, he would recognize the same fundamental dynamic. Today, we navigate similar dynamics in countless digital interactions with systems that hold authority over our lives. Credit scores determine our access to housing and employment. Algorithms shape what information we encounter. Automated systems make decisions about our insurance claims, our social media visibility, even our romantic connections. These systems possess enormous power over our daily existence, yet they operate without warmth, without context, without understanding of our individual circumstances. Orwell's childhood experience of distant paternal authority provides a framework for recognizing this modern phenomenon, authority that functions through position and process rather than relationship and care. And so we can gently turn our attention to the wider implications of these formative years. The question becomes not whether these systems work efficiently, but whether they serve human flourishing or merely maintain their own operational logic. Reflecting on Orwell's early life encourages us to seek out authentic human connection within structures of power, to ask where authority has become too distant, too automated, too divorced from genuine accountability to those it serves. Let the thought of this distinction rest quietly with you as we continue our exploration. In British India, Orwell was born into an imperial structure that revealed the early contours of global power. The young Eric Blair's first breath was drawn not in the rolling countryside of England, but in Motihari, Bengal Presidency, a place where the British Empire's vast machinery operated in the humid heat of colonial administration. His father served in the opium department, overseeing the production and storage of opium for export to China, a system that revealed how entire populations could be shaped by distant decisions made in boardrooms and government offices. This was his inheritance, a world where power flowed through institutions, where human lives were managed by economic systems half a world away. The insight emerging from this moment is that large systems shape personal identity in ways we seldom notice. Young Eric, could not have understood that his family's position in the colonial hierarchy, neither fully imperial rulers nor colonized subjects, but somewhere in between, was already programming his understanding of power dynamics. His great-great-grandfather had owned Jamaican plantations worked by enslaved people, creating a direct line between the family's prosperity and the machinery of human exploitation. These bloodlines and institutional connections would later inform his writing, though it would take years for him to fully comprehend how profoundly his origins had shaped his vision. Today's globalized world still exerts similar pressures across cultures. The digital platforms that shape our thoughts, the multinational corporations that influence our daily choices, the international economic systems that determine prosperity or scarcity. These are the modern inheritors of the imperial machinery that surrounded young Orwell's birth. Just as the opium department shaped lives across continents through its policies, today's social media algorithms quietly influence how we see ourselves and our place in the world. The systems are more subtle now, less overtly brutal than colonial rule, but they still operate on the principle that large structures can direct human behavior in ways individuals barely comprehend. Reflecting on this helps viewers see how inherited systems influence their own worldview. Each of us carries the unconscious imprint of the institutions and power structures we grow up within, our family's economic position, our national identity, the cultural narratives that surround our early development. These don't determine our future choices, but they do provide the lens through which we first understand how the world operates. Orwell would spend his lifetime examining how these hidden structures of power operate, but it was his birth in colonial India, this first glimpse of empire's reach into private life, that first awakened his awareness that the personal and the political were never truly separate. Let this thought linger as we prepare to journey into Orwell's years in colonial Burma. In colonial Burma, Orwell witnessed firsthand the corrosive effect of ruling others, revealing an uncomfortable truth about authority. The young Eric Blair, serving in the Indian Imperial Police from 1922 to 1927, found himself positioned as an instrument of imperial power in the far reaches of the British Empire. Stationed first in the notorious Insine prison and later in Moulmein, climbing to the rank of assistant district superintendent, he was tasked with maintaining order through the machinery of colonial control. But what he discovered there would fundamentally reshape his understanding of power, morality, and human nature itself. In the tropical heat of Rangoon's prison compounds and the dusty streets of Moulmein, Orwell encountered what he later termed the dirty work of empire at close quarters. He found himself ruling over people who, as he acknowledged with painful honesty, actively disliked him. The young colonial officer experienced the unique psychological burden of exercising authority over those who saw him not as a protector, but as an oppressor. This Burmese experience revealed to Orwell the moral distortion embedded in imperial governance. He realized that the colonial system created a fundamental paradox. Those who claimed to bring civilization and order were, in fact, perpetuating violence and dehumanization. More troubling still, he observed how power intoxicated even well-meaning individuals, gradually eroding their capacity for empathy and moral judgment. The imperial officer, tasked with maintaining order, found himself becoming the very force he initially believed he was restraining. The Burma years crystallized Orwell's conviction that authority, when unchallenged, creates a web of moral compromise that ensnares everyone within its reach. He came to understand that the experience of being controlled by a distant, impersonal power generates a particular form of psychic damage in both rulers and subjects. The ruler learns to see people as problems to be managed rather than as individuals deserving of dignity, while the ruled learn powerlessness and dependence. This dynamic, Orwell recognized, was not limited to colonial contexts, but could emerge wherever hierarchical relationships became institutionalized and unaccountable. And so, in his resignation letter in 1927, ending his imperial service, Orwell carried with him not just a collection of stories, but a profound insight into the psychological mechanisms of domination. An insight that would prove remarkably prescient in understanding how power shapes consciousness in the modern world. Let that thought rest as we turn to one of Orwell's most powerful meditations on the nature of performative power. When Orwell faced the pressured decision to shoot an elephant, it revealed how society forces individuals to betray their conscience. In the stifling heat of Moulmein and Burma in 1926, Orwell found himself trapped in a peculiar psychological imprisonment. As a British police officer in an occupied land, he was simultaneously resented by the Burmese people and aware of the injustice of the colonial system. Yet his uniform bound him to embody the very tyranny he privately condemned. Imagine standing at the center of a silent, watching crowd of nearly 2,000 people, all anticipating your action. The elephant, once tame, now agitated from trampling an Indian man to death, had finally calmed, standing peacefully in a paddy field. Orwell knew the elephant no longer posed a threat. He did not want to shoot it. But the faces surrounding him, their eyes filled with expectation, created an invisible web of pressure that began to constrict his freedom from within. This moment was not merely about an elephant, but about the profound psychological mechanics of power and conformity. The colonial uniform had become a mask, and Orwell observed how his face was growing to fit it. The very performance of authority was beginning to reshape the person performing it. As Orwell raised the rifle, he realized the tragic irony of his situation. When the white man turns tyrant, it is his own freedom that he destroys. By shooting the elephant to satisfy the crowd's expectations, he was not exercising genuine authority, but submitting to a more subtle form of tyranny, the tyranny of perception, of social performance. The elephant's death became a metaphor for something far deeper than colonial violence. It represented the way institutional power co-opts individual conscience. Orwell didn't shoot the elephant because it was the morally right action. He shot it because that's what was expected of him in his role as a symbol of imperial authority. Notice how this dynamic operates beyond colonial contexts. Any institutional role, from corporate executive to social media influencer to public official, creates similar pressures to perform rather than to act with integrity. The uniform of our positions, whether literal or metaphorical, begins to shape our decisions before we've even consciously considered them. In our digital age, we see a new form of this same phenomenon. Social media platforms have created vast audiences watching our every move, much like that crowd of 2,000 in Moulmein. The pressure to perform authenticity, to share the perfect moment, to have the right opinion. All of this mirrors the psychological prison Orwell encountered. Consider how often we find ourselves posting, commenting, or acting online, not from genuine conviction, but to maintain our carefully curated image. The like button has become the digital equivalent of those watching eyes in Burma, creating subtle but powerful incentives to conform our behavior to external expectations rather than internal principles. How then do we preserve our freedom when faced with these ubiquitous performative pressures? Orwell's experience offers several crucial lessons. First, recognize that the mask you're wearing, your professional persona, your online identity, your social role, is not who you are. Second, cultivate what might be called ethical courage, the willingness to occasionally disappoint people rather than disappoint yourself. This doesn't mean becoming contrarian for its own sake, but developing the strength to act according to your values even when others might disapprove. And finally, understand that every act of integrity, no matter how small, creates ripple effects. Orwell's essay itself became a powerful act of truth-telling that continues to inspire ethical reflection nearly a century later. The quiet crisis Orwell identified remains our crisis: how to remain free in a world that constantly pressures us to perform rather than to be. Let this thought settle gently as we prepare to journey into Orwell's experiences in the Spanish Civil War. In the Spanish Civil War, Orwell encountered betrayal within political factions that promised liberation. Picture, if you will, a young idealist arriving in Barcelona with the conviction that he's joining a noble fight for human freedom. Orwell had traveled to Spain in late 1936, inspired by reports of workers rising against fascism. But what he discovered there would profoundly reshape his understanding of political truth and human nature. The Republican side, supposedly united against Franco's forces, was fractured into competing factions: the communists, the anarchists, the POUM to which Orwell belonged, and others. Each claimed to represent the true path to liberation, yet each seemed equally willing to betray the others when it served their interests. This fragmentation wasn't merely political complexity, it was a systematic betrayal of the very ideals that had drawn Orwell to Spain. Orwell experienced this betrayal firsthand when the communist faction turned against his own poem comrades, accusing them of being fascist agents. Files were fabricated, arrests made, and truth became whatever served the political moment. The man who had come to fight for freedom found himself running for his life, fleeing across the Pyrenees as his former allies sought to destroy him. This experience crystallized Orwell's growing belief that truth must be defended even when, especially when, allies distort it. In our current political climate, we witness similar fractures around competing narratives: social media echo chambers, partisan news sources, political spin, all serve the same fragmentation that Orwell witnessed in Barcelona. The temptation to accept convenient lies within our own ideological circles remains as strong as ever. To apply Orwell's lesson is to practice intellectual humility within our political commitments. Seek clarity even within groups you support. Question narratives that feel too convenient, too simple, too perfectly aligned with your existing beliefs. Truth, Orwell learned, is fragile under ideological pressure, but it's worth defending, even when it complicates our affiliations. Let this understanding guide us as we turn to Orwell's investigation of inequality in industrial England. What if inequality is most dangerous when it becomes invisible? Orwell's journey through working-class England revealed suffering hidden behind industrial progress. In 1937, Orwell made a deliberate choice that would reshape his understanding of human dignity. He left behind the comfortable world of literary London and descended into the coal-mining districts of northern England, not as an observer from a distance, but as someone who would live among those whose labour powered the empire's machinery, while they themselves remained faceless and voiceless. This wasn't merely journalistic research, it was philosophical archaeology, excavating the buried truths beneath society's official narratives. What Orwell discovered challenged something far more insidious than simple poverty. He found communities where inequality had become so normalized, so woven into the fabric of daily existence, that it appeared natural, even inevitable. The miners he lived alongside didn't complain about 12-hour shifts in conditions that would break most people's spirits, because complaining had become useless. Their suffering had been invisibly absorbed into the system's architecture itself. This was inequality without spectacle, without the dramatic poverty that might prompt reform, but with a quietly devastating efficiency that made human dignity a luxury few could afford. In the sanitized version of progress that dominated public discourse, these industrial centers were celebrated as symbols of national strength and technological achievement. The coal that heated England's homes and powered its factories was celebrated, but the human cost of extracting it remained carefully hidden from view. Orwell recognized that true totalitarianism doesn't require chains and prison cells. It requires making the suffering of others feel normal, routine, invisible. When inequality becomes too familiar to be shocking, it becomes too powerful to be challenged. Today, we can see Orwell's insight reflected in our digital divides, in economic inequality that presents itself as meritocratic success, in environmental degradation that affects others but not ourselves. The most dangerous inequalities are those we've learned not to see, those that fit so comfortably within our daily routines that questioning them feels unreasonable, even ungrateful. And so we can gently turn our attention to our own communities. Orwell's journey teaches us that freedom begins with the simple act of looking, really looking, at what our progress costs others, at what remains unseen in our communities, at what we've accepted as normal simply because it's always been there. The road to Wigan Pier leads not just to understanding poverty, but to understanding how truth itself can be buried beneath layers of comfortable assumptions. Let that awareness rest with you as we continue. When Orwell analyzed political writing, he uncovered how language manipulates thought. This exploration revealed his famous insight: corrupted language leads to corrupted reality. In his pivotal 1946 essay, Politics and the English Language, Orwell observed something profound about the relationship between words and thought. He noticed that political language was becoming increasingly corrupted through dying metaphors, pretentious diction, and high-flown rhetoric. But more disturbingly, he recognized that this linguistic decay went hand in hand with declining intellectual rigor in society itself. When we allow our language to become vague and imprecise, we inadvertently surrender our capacity for clear thinking. The words we use shape the very contours of our consciousness. This insight led Orwell to create newspeak in his novel 1984, a controlled language where vocabulary constantly diminished, designed specifically to prevent people from articulating abstract concepts like personal identity, self-expression, and free will. Orwell understood that when language becomes controlled, thought becomes controlled, and when thought becomes controlled, freedom itself withers. In our contemporary world, we witness this same phenomenon manifesting in subtler but equally powerful ways. Social media algorithms curate our language by showing us only the content that reinforces our existing beliefs. Corporate PR departments craft messages that obscure rather than illuminate. Political discourse increasingly relies on sound bites and slogans that reduce complex issues to emotional triggers. We find ourselves living within echo chambers where our vocabulary becomes limited by the narrow range of ideas we're permitted to encounter. The ancient Greeks understood this truth when they placed such importance on rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking. But Orwell showed us the darker side of this power. Language can be weaponized not just to persuade, but to narrow the very boundaries of what we can conceive. When we allow others to control our language, we allow them to control our reality. Tonight's meditation teaches us to remain vigilant guardians of language, choosing precision over convenience, depth over simplification, truth over comfort. In protecting language, we protect the foundation of all human freedom. Let this awareness settle as we explore the mechanics of newspeak more deeply. What if limiting words could limit freedom? This is the profound question at the heart of Orwell's newspeak, a linguistic system designed not to express human thought, but to prevent it. In the sterile corridors of the Ministry of Truth, the party didn't simply control what people could say, they controlled what they could even conceive. Newspeak wasn't born from linguistic innovation, but from political necessity. Orwell understood something crucial, that language shapes the very boundaries of human consciousness. When vocabulary shrinks, thought becomes constrained. When expressions simplify, complexity dies. The party's linguistic engineers knew that by reducing words, they could reduce possibilities. By eliminating nuanced terms, they could eliminate nuanced thinking. Orwell's creation of Newspeak emerged from his study of actual political euphemisms, the contractions of Nazi Germany like Gestapo, the bureaucratic shortenings of Soviet Russia like Politburo. But he went further, creating a language where good think would replace independent thought, where crime think would replace rebelling against authority. The genius of Newspeak wasn't in its propaganda value, but in its systematic approach to linguistic limitation. In Orwell's appendix to 1984, he explains how the vocabulary would diminish each year. By the year 2050, there would be no need for books like this one, because there would be no way to conceive of the rebellion it describes. The party understood that freedom begins with the ability to name one's experience. Strip away the words, and you strip away the very capacity for resistance. Today, we witness similar patterns in our own discourse. The polarized sound bites on social media, the simplified slogans that reduce complex issues to bumper stickers, the way political language has become increasingly binary. These aren't just linguistic choices, they're thought-limiting mechanisms. Consider how modern political speech replaces nuanced policy discussions with phrases like fake news, deep state, or alternative facts. When complex geopolitical situations get reduced to us versus them, we've begun speaking in Newspeak. But here's where we can learn from Orwell's warning. The antidote to Newspeak isn't complexity for its own sake, but precision. Nurturing expansive language means cultivating the ability to describe the full range of human experience. This doesn't mean using unnecessarily elaborate words, but rather maintaining the precision needed to distinguish between similar but distinct concepts. Instead of fascist, we might learn to distinguish between authoritarian, totalitarian, or autocratic. Instead of fake news, we might differentiate between misinformation, disinformation, and honest error. Every time we choose the more precise term, we resist the simplification that limits thought. The birth of Newspeak was meant to be the death of nuanced thought, but by understanding this mechanism, we can ensure it remains fictional. Let this commitment to linguistic precision guide you as we continue our journey. In imagining the constant surveillance of Big Brother, Orwell revealed the deep psychological impact of being watched. This wasn't merely a technological nightmare, but a profound exploration of how observation transforms the very essence of human consciousness. When we believe we are being observed, something fundamental shifts within us. We become different people, or perhaps we become more ourselves than we realize. Consider how you might behave if you knew someone was watching you right now, in this moment of quiet contemplation. Would you adjust your posture? Would you filter your thoughts differently? This subtle self-consciousness, this internal pause between thought and expression, lies at the heart of Orwell's insight about surveillance. The mechanisms by which observation reshapes behavior run deeper than simple self-consciousness. Orwell understood that the human mind, when under persistent watch, develops a kind of internal censorship, not merely of actions, but of thought itself. This echoes Jeremy Bentham's 18th century concept of the panopticon prison design, where inmates, unsure if they're being observed, regulate themselves continuously. The genius of Big Brother's gaze isn't the active surveillance itself, but the uncertainty of always potentially being watched. This creates a state of perpetual self-discipline that penetrates to the core of what we permit ourselves to think, feel, and even dream. In Orwell's vision, this psychological transformation becomes the ultimate totalitarian control, not forcing people to comply, but making them complicit in their own suppression. Today, we find ourselves in an era where Orwell's thought experiment has manifested in ways even more sophisticated than he imagined. Our digital lives generate vast troves of personal data through smartphones, social media, search histories, and countless app interactions. These platforms don't need to be explicitly watching us to influence behavior. Our awareness that we might be observed is often sufficient. Consider the subtle shifts you've noticed in your own online behavior. The pause before clicking certain links. The way you might edit a message before sending it, wondering how it might be interpreted or stored. The conscious decisions about what to share, what to like, what to search for, aware that these digital footprints might be analyzed. This isn't merely about privacy policies or data protection, though these matter greatly. It's about how the shadow of potential observation creates a psychological environment where authentic self-expression becomes increasingly difficult, and where our behavior, even in private moments, begins to accommodate imagined surveillance. In light of these insights, we might reflect on how we can cultivate genuine spaces of privacy and authentic expression in our daily lives. This could mean choosing to write in physical journals rather than digital documents, engaging in face-to-face conversations without recording devices, or deliberately creating technology-free moments of self-reflection. Perhaps most importantly, we can practice recognizing the subtle ways we've internalized the observer's gaze, the internal critic who censors thoughts before they've fully formed, the self-policing that occurs when we feel we might be watched. Orwell's Big Brother serves as both warning and philosophical mirror, reflecting our deepest anxieties about power, freedom, and authentic selfhood. By understanding how observation shapes us, we become better equipped to preserve those essential spaces where we can exist without performance, without pretense, without the weight of constant potential scrutiny. Let this awareness rest gently with you as we prepare to explore the concept of doublethink. What if holding two contradictory beliefs became normal? Orwell's concept of doublethink captures the mental strain of political manipulation, and it reveals something far more unsettling than we might initially imagine. The term itself, carried from the pages of 1984, speaks to a psychological mechanism that transforms the human mind into a battlefield where truth and falsehood wage eternal war, not through dramatic conflict, but through the quiet surrender of logical coherence. When we accept that two opposing truths can coexist simply because we need them to, we enter a realm where the very foundations of rational thought begin to crumble. Doublethink operates as Orwell's most subtle form of mental control, not through brute force or obvious indoctrination, but through the gradual normalization of cognitive dissonance. In the world of Oceania, citizens are required to believe that war is peace, that freedom is slavery, that ignorance is strength. But these aren't merely slogans to chant. They represent a deeper psychological conditioning that trains the mind to accept contradiction as a form of truth. The genius of doublethink lies in its recognition that totalitarian control isn't achieved by making people believe lies, but by making them believe that truth and falsehood can occupy the same mental space, that convenience can replace consistency, and that loyalty can transcend logic. Consider how truth collapses when convenience replaces honesty in our daily lives. We speak of valuing authenticity while consuming manufactured content, championing transparency while accepting opaque explanations. proclaiming our commitment to facts while gravitating toward information that confirms our preconceptions. These aren't grand political statements, they're quiet concessions where our desire for psychological comfort outweighs our commitment to intellectual integrity. Today's cognitive dissonance in public discourse echoes this danger with startling clarity. We witness political figures who simultaneously claim to champion fiscal responsibility while supporting policies that increase debt, who advocate for family values while exhibiting personal conduct that contradicts those values. More unsettling still is our collective tolerance for these contradictions, our willingness to accept that people can hold completely opposing positions without losing credibility, as if consistency were an optional virtue rather than a cornerstone of rational thought. Applying Orwell's insight means noticing the contradictions we accept for comfort, the way we can simultaneously judge others harshly while excusing similar behavior in ourselves, how we can claim to value privacy while willingly sharing intimate details of our lives, how we can express outrage about injustice while remaining passive in the face of injustice that doesn't directly affect us. These aren't moral failings in the traditional sense. They're symptoms of doublethink, working its quiet magic, training us to accept that the tension between our ideals and our actions is simply the natural state of human existence. But when we begin to recognize these patterns, when we notice how often we choose psychological comfort over logical consistency, we glimpse the first signs of our liberation from the subtle manipulations that would reduce our thinking to a series of convenient contradictions. Let this awareness guide you as we turn to examine the internal thought police. Now we explore one of the most chilling aspects of Orwell's dystopian vision, the thought police within our own minds. The character Winston Smith, in his private moments, experiences a profound fear that Orwell presents with masterful psychological insight. It's not just that Winston fears being watched by Big Brother's external surveillance, though that certainly haunts him. More unsettling is his growing awareness that he has begun to police his own thoughts. This internalization of control represents a crucial transition in Orwell's critique of totalitarian power. When external authority penetrates so deeply into our consciousness that we become both the observer and the observed, the oppressor and the oppressed, freedom becomes not just restricted, but fundamentally altered. Orwell's genius lies in recognizing how totalitarianism succeeds not merely through force, but by transforming the psychological landscape itself. The thought police, as a literal entity in Oceania, pale in comparison to the thought police that Winston carries within his own mind. This internal surveillance emerges from what we might call the anticipatory reflex, our mind's remarkable ability to predict potential punishment and adjust behavior preemptively. In the novel, Winston's journal entries begin with this haunting line: "If you want to keep a secret, you must also hide it from yourself." This seemingly paradoxical statement reveals Orwell's insight into how self-knowledge itself becomes a form of thought crime. The terrifying moment arrives when Winston realizes he no longer knows what he truly believes, whether his rebellion is authentic or simply another expression of his conditioning. The profound relevance of this insight becomes clear when we consider our contemporary social dynamics. While we may not live in Oceania, we do inhabit digital ecosystems where social judgment functions as a modern thought police. Consider how the fear of social media backlash, professional consequences, or political ostracization shapes what we share, what we like, and even what we think. This subtle form of self-censorship operates not through overt threats, but through the internalization of potential external judgment. We begin to edit our own thoughts before they fully form, filtering through imagined consequences. The question, "What will others think?" evolves into "what should I think?", gradually eroding the boundary between authentic inner experience and externally conditioned response. Orwell's insight proves remarkably prescient. The most effective thought police don't need to patrol the streets when they have established headquarters within our minds. Perhaps most concerning is how this process can become unconscious. Like Winston, we may find our authentic thoughts increasingly difficult to locate, buried beneath layers of anticipatory editing. Recognizing the presence of this internal thought police marks the first step toward reclaiming authentic thought. Orwell's vision serves not as an inevitable prophecy, but as a cautionary insight into the fragility of freedom. When we notice those moments, when we edit our thoughts before fully forming them, when we ask, "Should I really think this?" rather than, "What do I think?" we glimpse the machinery of our internal thought police at work. The ultimate question Orwell leaves us with is this: in a world of subtle surveillance and social judgment, how do we preserve the sacred space of unedited inner experience? For Winston, that space ultimately collapsed. For us, recognition may be the first step toward resistance. Let this awareness rest gently with you as we continue into the memory hole. In imagining the memory hole, Orwell showed how societies erase uncomfortable truths. Within the Ministry of Truth where Winston Smith labored, the memory hole served as more than mere incineration. It represented the systematic destruction of inconvenient realities. Down these narrow chutes disappeared not just documents, but entire histories, entire lives, entire ways of being that no longer aligned with the party's ever-shifting narrative. When something disappeared into those flames, it was as if it had never existed at all. The brilliant, terrifying precision of this system lay not in its violence, but in its subtlety. The Ministry of Truth didn't merely destroy evidence. It rewrote the very concept that evidence had ever existed. A critic yesterday became a loyal supporter today, because yesterday's criticism had been memory-holed. And today's loyalty reflected the eternal truth that had supposedly always been. This is where Orwell's genius transcends mere dystopian fiction. He understood that truth isn't merely suppressed, it is actively reconstructed through the careful management of what we remember and what we forget. The memory hole represents the ultimate form of control, not just controlling what people think, but controlling what they can conceive as thinkable. Today, we navigate our own landscape of digital memory holes. Your social media algorithms curate your feed, determining which stories gain visibility and which fade into obscurity. Search engines rank results, effectively deciding which information deserves your attention and which remains buried beneath layers of digital sediment. This isn't the Ministry of Truth's brute force destruction. This is algorithmic deletion through strategic invisibility. The uncomfortable truth about climate change, the inconvenient statistic about economic inequality, the disturbing detail about political corruption, all can be made effectively non-existent, not through flames, but through careful omission. But here's where our modern moment differs from Winston's world. We have the tools to resist these contemporary memory holes. We can maintain alternative sources of information, seek out perspectives deliberately excluded from our algorithmic bubbles, archive important articles before they disappear from dynamic websites. This requires what we might call information stewardship, the gentle practice of curating not just what enters our mind, but what we allow to exit from our collective memory. Like tending a garden, we must cultivate truth consciously, knowing that without such care, what is beautiful and essential can be overgrown by what is convenient and profitable. Perhaps the most profound insight Orwell offers is that the memory hole's power comes not from what it destroys, but from what it allows to grow in that destroyed space. When we collectively forget the lessons of past mistakes, we become vulnerable to repeating them. In our age of infinite information and strategic forgetfulness, preserving truth becomes an act of quiet rebellion, a gentle insistence that some things matter enough to remember, even when forgetting would be easier, more profitable, more comfortable. Let this thought rest with you as we explore Winston's daily struggle. What if independent thinking required constant vigilance? This question haunts us as we consider Winston Smith's daily struggle in George Orwell's 1984. Each morning, Winston wakes to a world where his thoughts must be carefully guarded, where even the briefest spark of independent judgment could mark him for persecution by the thought police. The labor of maintaining clarity in such a world reveals something profound about the nature of freedom itself. Orwell's genius lies in showing us how conformity erodes critical judgment not through overt oppression alone, but through the systematic erosion of our capacity for independent thought. The Ministry of Truth doesn't merely destroy information, it systematically reshapes reality itself. Winston's work of constantly rewriting history illustrates how truth becomes malleable when no independent perspective remains to challenge it. The party's newspeak language strips thought of nuance, while doublethink forces citizens to hold contradictory beliefs simultaneously, eroding their ability to distinguish truth from falsehood. This insight reveals the profound labor of maintaining clarity. Unlike passive consumption of information, genuine thinking requires active engagement with complexity, discomfort, and contradiction. Winston's hidden journal becomes a sanctuary for authentic thought. Writing becomes an act of resistance against the systematic simplification demanded by totalitarian control. Each honest sentence he writes represents an act of intellectual courage, a refusal to surrender to the easier path of conformity. Modern echo chambers amplify this ancient risk. Today, we navigate digital spaces that algorithmically reinforce our existing beliefs, creating comfortable bubbles of agreement that mirror Orwell's vision of controlled information. Social media platforms optimize for engagement rather than accuracy, often preferring simple, emotionally satisfying narratives over complex truths. The result mirrors the party's manipulation. Rather than being forced to accept contradiction, we can instead curate an information environment that reinforces our preconceptions, making independent thinking feel unnecessary or even uncomfortable. And so, we can gently turn our attention to our own mental lives. We can apply Orwell's wisdom by actively seeking diverse perspectives that challenge our assumptions. This doesn't require abandoning critical thinking. Rather, it means practicing intellectual humility, remaining open to evidence that contradicts our preferences. The resistance to conformity isn't found in stubborn disagreement, but in the disciplined practice of examining our own thinking processes. True intellectual freedom lies not in never changing our minds, but in maintaining the capacity to think independently when the weight of society pushes us toward comfortable conformity. Let this understanding guide us as we turn to Animal Farm. When the pigs slowly became indistinguishable from the humans, Orwell revealed the cycle of revolution becoming tyranny. Picture the barnyard at dawn, where Napoleon and his companions stand on their hind legs, walking upright like their former oppressors. The transformation is so gradual, so insidious, that even the other animals struggle to identify exactly when it began. This is Orwell's masterstroke, showing us that the most dangerous revolutions are not those that fail immediately, but those that succeed completely, transforming the revolutionaries into the very thing they once fought against. The pigs didn't set out to become tyrannical. They believed in the original commandments: all animals are equal. But power, as Orwell understood so deeply, has its own gravitational pull. Each compromise, each justification, each step away from the founding principles was rationalized as necessary, temporary, strategic. Consider the moment when the 7 commandments begin to change. No animal shall drink alcohol becomes, no animal shall drink alcohol to excess. The word excess, so subjective, so easily manipulated by those in power. This linguistic flexibility reveals the deeper mechanism of how ideals decay. The pigs don't wake up one morning and declare themselves dictators. Instead, they gradually reshape the language itself, rewriting the very foundations of their revolutionary principles. Each alteration seems reasonable in isolation. Each compromise serves a practical purpose in the moment, but together they form a pattern that reveals the inevitable progression of unchecked power. The most chilling aspect of Orwell's vision is how the other animals become complicit in their own subjugation. Boxer, the loyal workhorse, still chants, "I will work harder," even as his strength is exploited. The sheep bleat, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, then 4 legs good, 2 legs better, without truly understanding the change. Their compliance reveals how propaganda works not through force alone, but through the gradual erosion of critical thinking. In our contemporary world, we witness variations of this same pattern in social movements, political organizations, and even corporate cultures that began with noble missions. The startup that once promised to change the world gradually becomes just another profit-driven corporation. The activist group that fought for transparency slowly develops its own inner circle of secrets and unaccountable decisions. The religious community founded on principles of equality slowly develops hierarchies that mirror the secular world's power structures. Orwell's genius lies not in predicting specific events, but in revealing the psychological and sociological mechanisms that make such transformations almost inevitable when certain conditions persist. Concentrated power, lack of accountability, isolation from the original mission, and the human tendency to rationalize compromise as wisdom. Consider how this applies to any group you're involved with, a workplace, a community organization, even a circle of friends. Where do you see gradual shifts in language? Where do people begin using different standards for themselves than they would accept from others? The warning signs are often subtle: exceptional justifications for exceptional circumstances, increasing secrecy for security reasons, the emergence of untouchable leaders who are above questioning. This brings us to the most profound question Orwell leaves us with. Is this cycle unavoidable? Must every revolution eventually consume itself? Or are there ways to build systems that can resist this gravitational pull toward corruption? Orwell suggests that the answer lies not in the ideals themselves, which are often noble and necessary, but in the mechanisms we create to protect those ideals over time. Regular rotation of leadership, transparent decision-making processes, external accountability, and most importantly, the willingness of individuals within any system to maintain their critical faculties even when doing so is uncomfortable or inconvenient. The pigs' transformation was not inevitable because they were inherently evil, but because they were not constrained by structures that could have preserved their original vision. They believed their intentions were pure enough to transcend the need for such constraints. This is the eternal seduction of power, the belief that we will be the exception to history's patterns, that our good intentions make us immune to the corruption that corrupted others. Let this awareness settle gently in your mind, understanding that recognizing these patterns is the first step toward creating systems that can resist them. Tomorrow, when you observe the organizations and movements around you, watch for the gradual shifts in language and behavior. Remember that freedom and truth require constant vigilance, not just from our leaders, but from each of us who wish to preserve what is worthy in our shared human endeavors. Let these reflections linger softly as we prepare for the next revelation. Room 101 represents how fear breaks human will. In Orwell's Ministry of Love, Winston Smith sits in that chamber, knowing that his worst fear, being devoured by rats, awaits him behind the metal cage. The genius of Room 101 lies not in its physical horrors, but in its psychological precision. O'Brien explains that everyone's worst fear is different, carefully discovered through months of systematic torture. The mechanism is simple, yet devastating. Identify what matters most to a person's soul, then threaten its destruction. For Winston, it was not physical pain that broke him, but the absolute terror of watching helplessly as those repulsive creatures threatened everything he held dear. This reveals how totalitarian power fundamentally understands human psychology. Unlike crude force, which merely attempts to destroy the body, sophisticated control targets the very essence of what makes us human: our attachments, our capacity for love, our sense of identity. Orwell drew from real historical sources when crafting Room 101. His experiences in the Spanish Civil War had shown him how political movements could weaponize fear, creating an atmosphere where truth became fluid and loyalty became survival. The psychological torture in Room 101 reflects techniques used by authoritarian regimes throughout history, isolating the individual, breaking their connections to others, then rebuilding their entire psychological framework around the state's requirements. Winston's betrayal of Julia represents something deeper than mere cowardice. It demonstrates how fear can reconstruct our moral compass, making us willing to sacrifice our deepest relationships for the promise of safety. In our contemporary world, these same psychological mechanisms operate through more subtle channels. Consider the modern anxiety about financial security, the fear that a single mistake could destroy years of careful planning. Economic systems exploit this by making basic needs conditional, creating a permanent state of precarity that keeps populations compliant. Social media platforms weaponize our deepest fear of rejection and isolation. The carefully curated feeds designed to trigger comparison and inadequacy operate on the same principle as Room 101. They identify what we value most: connection, acceptance, belonging, then structure our environment to make those things feel perpetually at risk. Digital surveillance creates a constant awareness that our private thoughts and behaviors are being monitored, not unlike Winston's constant awareness of the telescreen. Each notification, each algorithm-designed interaction nudges us toward prescribed patterns of thought and behavior. Yet recognizing fear's role in these systems becomes the first step toward reclaiming agency. Orwell shows us that true resistance begins with understanding how our minds can be manipulated. When we recognize that our deepest anxieties about security, acceptance, truth can be systematically exploited, we develop the ability to hold our fears consciously while simultaneously questioning whether they deserve to govern our lives. Just as Winston eventually learned to love Big Brother, we can learn to love the uncertainty and imperfection that define authentic human experience. In understanding how fear breaks the will, we discover how wisdom rebuilds it, not through blind courage, but through conscious choice in the face of uncertainty. Let this insight rest gently as we turn to Winston's final act of resistance. When Winston scribbled those forbidden words in his diary, "Down with Big Brother," George Orwell revealed something profound about the nature of human resistance. In that small, trembling act of writing, Winston wasn't just breaking a law. He was reclaiming the very essence of what makes us human. The diary became his sanctuary of truth in a world where reality itself was malleable, where the party could declare that war was peace, that freedom was slavery, But in those private pages, Winston could still think his own thoughts, still remember what words meant before they were twisted beyond recognition. This wasn't heroic rebellion against an army. It was something far more dangerous to totalitarian power, one person refusing to let their inner life be colonized. And so we can gently turn our attention to why these smallest acts of defiance matter so profoundly. Orwell understood that totalitarianism doesn't crush freedom only through gulags and secret police. It works by slowly making us forget that we once thought differently. The party's genius lay not in forcing Winston to love Big Brother, but in making him doubt his own memory, his own perceptions, his own capacity for independent thought. Each small surrender, each time he accepted a contradiction as normal, each moment he suppressed a questioning thought, bit by tiny bit, his authentic self eroded. But the diary stood as a bulwark against this erosion. In those pages, Winston could still write that 2 + 2 = 4, not because the party had commanded it, but because his mathematical intuition, his very capacity for reason, demanded it. Today, we face subtler but perhaps equally insidious forms of this same colonization of consciousness. Our distraction-driven culture, with its endless streams of curated content and algorithmic rabbit holes, doesn't force us to believe contradictions. It simply makes it easier to stop thinking deeply altogether. Social media platforms don't tell us what to think. They simply make deep, sustained thinking increasingly difficult. We don't live under Big Brother's surveillance, yet we voluntarily surrender our attention to devices that know us better than we know ourselves. The modern equivalent of Winston's diary might be the simple act of putting pen to paper each morning, writing not for an audience, not for productivity, but simply to remember that your thoughts are still your own. It's the choice to read a book instead of scrolling, to take a quiet walk instead of filling every moment with stimulation. These aren't grand gestures, they're quiet declarations of independence. Consider starting with something as simple as keeping a morning page. Just 3 minutes of unfiltered writing before the world intrudes. Not a blog post, not a tweet, not content for others to consume, but pure expression of your inner voice. Or practice the art of mindful choices. When you reach for your phone, pause and ask yourself why. When you feel the urge to share an opinion online, consider whether you're thinking it through or simply reacting. These micro moments of awareness, these tiny pauses between impulse and action, are the seeds from which authentic resistance grows. Orwell showed us that the pen, and in our case, the simple act of conscious choice, remains mightier than the sword of total control. In preserving our capacity for private thought, we preserve the possibility of public truth. Let that thought settle as we explore Orwell's prophetic vision of surveillance. Orwell saw the rise of surveillance society decades before it became real, explaining today's data-driven anxieties. Think about your own digital life for a moment. Every click, every search, every location ping creates a detailed portrait of who you are, what you desire, and how you think. What Winston Smith could never have imagined was that millions of people would voluntarily carry tracking devices in their pockets, eagerly sharing their most intimate thoughts and movements with invisible corporations. The genius of Orwell's vision wasn't just the technology itself, but understanding how technological convenience could become the Trojan horse for comprehensive surveillance. Consider the subtle ways this manifests in our daily experience. Your smartphone knows your daily routine better than you do, suggesting routes before you've even decided where to go. Social media platforms can predict your mood swings, your political leanings, even your relationship status, often before you're consciously aware of these changes yourself. This is the modern telescreen, and unlike Winston's rigid device mounted on a wall, ours whispers suggestions we often don't realize we're following. The algorithmic influence Orwell foresaw operates through what we might call comfort conditioning, gradually adjusting our digital environment so that what seems convenient becomes what seems necessary. These systems don't demand your submission like the thought police. Instead, they gently guide your choices toward predetermined outcomes, creating the illusion of free will while subtly narrowing your options. When your newsfeed shows you increasingly extreme content, when your shopping suggestions become eerily specific to your unspoken desires, when your map applications route you past certain businesses, you're experiencing the gentle pressure of algorithmic governance. The control feels almost invisible because it masquerades as service. And so we arrive at perhaps the most crucial question Orwell never got to answer. How do we preserve our digital autonomy while participating in the connected world we've built? The answer lies not in rejecting technology entirely, but in developing what we might call digital mindfulness, the conscious awareness of when we're trading convenience for freedom. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, consider this. What boundaries might you establish? What digital spaces might remain private? What aspects of your inner life will you refuse to surrender to the algorithmic gaze? The answers you find in your quiet reflection may determine not just your own freedom, but the kind of digital society we're collectively choosing to inhabit. Let these questions rest gently with you as we turn to the battleground of truth itself. What if truth becomes a battlefield? Orwell warned of societies where facts dissolve under competing narratives. In the Ministry of Truth, Winston Smith's daily work involves constantly rewriting history, making yesterday's facts conform to today's political needs. But Orwell envisioned something even more insidious than outright lies. He saw a world where multiple versions of truth could coexist, each equally valid within its own sphere of influence. This is the nightmare of doublethink, made manifest in our information age, where once totalitarian regimes sought to control information through censorship, now we witness something more complex. Competing truth ecosystems flourish simultaneously, each with its own facts, its own experts, its own version of reality. Orwell understood that the manipulation of language was central to this process. In Politics and the English Language, he wrote about how pretentious diction and dying metaphors make it possible to think thoughts that ought not to be thought. Today, we see this in how complex issues get reduced to slogans that feel true but resist examination. Fake news becomes a term that can be applied to any information we dislike, regardless of its factual basis. Alternative facts suggests that reality itself is negotiable. The most chilling aspect of Orwell's prophecy is not that some people will believe lies, but that they will believe simultaneously in contradictory truths. In our social media feeds, we encounter this daily. The same event is reported with completely different facts, different explanations, different moral frameworks. But here is where Orwell's wisdom offers us a path forward. He believed that the corruption of language and thought was not inevitable. In the appendix to 1984, written in the past tense, he suggests that there were those who continued to think independently even under totalitarian rule. The secret to resisting this polarization lies not in choosing sides, but in cultivating what we might call intellectual humility. This means maintaining the capacity to say, "I don't know," when evidence is incomplete, to acknowledge uncertainty when conclusions are provisional. It also means recognizing that our need to be right often conflicts with our need to understand. When we prioritize being right over understanding, we become vulnerable to manipulation. The moment we stop asking questions and start demanding answers that confirm what we already believe, we step into the territory of doublethink. Orwell's solution, both practical and spiritual, was to anchor oneself in direct experience. In Homage to Catalonia, he wrote about how the world will not be destroyed by evil people, but by those who stand by and do nothing. This applies to our relationship with truth itself. We must become careful witnesses to our own experience. When we read a news story, we can ask, what would this look like if I experienced it directly? What questions remain unasked? What perspectives are missing? How does this story make me feel, and is that feeling relevant to the facts? This is not cynicism or skepticism for its own sake. Rather, it is the gentle discipline of maintaining our capacity for wonder and doubt. In a world where everything seems certain, the person who can say, perhaps, has retained their humanity. Orwell's greatest prophecy was not about the future of politics, but about the future of consciousness itself. The question is whether we will let others think for us, or whether we will choose the difficult but liberating path of thinking for ourselves. And in that choosing, we find not truth in its completeness, but the honest recognition that the search itself is what makes us fully human. Let this thought rest as we explore language as a tool of manipulation. Orwell foresaw language becoming a tool for political and social manipulation. And indeed, we find ourselves living in an age where words themselves have become battlefields. The very terms we use to describe our reality, the words freedom, security, truth, democracy, these have all become contested territories where different groups plant their flags and defend their interpretations. This linguistic warfare operates not through armies or weapons, but through the subtle erosion of meaning, the gradual shifting of definitions, and the strategic deployment of euphemisms that make the unacceptable seem palatable. We see this most clearly in what scholars call semantic drift, the way words slowly change meaning over time until they become nearly unrecognizable. The word literally now often means its opposite. Fake news has become a term that can be applied to both genuine misinformation and inconvenient truths. Corporate language transforms layoffs into restructuring and right-sizing. Political speech reframes invasions as special military operations. Each example represents what Orwell called duck speak, words that are uttered automatically without conscious thought, allowing speakers to avoid the moral weight of their meaning. These linguistic maneuvers don't just confuse, they create a fog that makes it difficult to distinguish between reality and fabrication, between genuine concern and manufactured outrage. But perhaps most insidious is the way social media platforms have amplified what Orwell might recognize as doublethink, holding two contradictory beliefs simultaneously and accepting both as true. We demand transparency while consuming anonymous propaganda. We champion free speech while promoting echo chambers. We celebrate diversity of thought while algorithmically filtering our information streams. The technology that promised to democratize information has instead created new forms of linguistic manipulation, where outrage is manufactured, facts are weaponized, and meaning itself becomes fluid and context-dependent. Yet within this linguistic chaos, Orwell offers us a quiet form of resistance, not through grand gestures, but through the deliberate practice of precision in our own speech. When we choose our words with intention, when we pause to consider not just what we mean, but what our words might convey, we participate in what we might call linguistic mindfulness. This doesn't mean we must speak like philosophers or academics. Rather, it means cultivating what Orwell called crystal clear thinking, the disciplined habit of connecting our thoughts to words and our words to reality. In small moments, when we describe something accurately rather than conveniently, when we admit uncertainty rather than assert false certainty, when we listen for meaning rather than just waiting to respond, we preserve the possibility of genuine communication in a world that often seems designed to prevent it. This quiet resistance, practiced one conversation at a time, may be our best defense against the erosion of meaning that Orwell so presciently warned us about. Let this understanding guide you as we consider truth as a daily practice. What if truth is less a fact than a habit? Orwell's work suggests that clarity must be renewed constantly. Consider this. We often speak of truth as if it were a destination, the moment we finally know something for certain. But Orwell understood something more subtle. In the world of Oceania, truth wasn't destroyed all at once. It was eroded through countless small compromises, daily acts of self-deception, tiny accommodations to absurdity. The Ministry of Truth didn't need to convince people that black was white in one grand gesture. It succeeded by making them practice doublethink until thinking clearly became genuinely uncomfortable. And so, we arrive at a profound question that each of us must answer. How do we keep our relationship with reality honest when the world constantly tempts us toward convenient illusions? The practice begins with what we might call reality maintenance. That daily discipline of checking our thoughts against evidence, examining our motives with gentle but persistent honesty. Orwell knew that totalitarian control succeeds not through perfect surveillance, but through the cooperation of people who gradually stop questioning, stop resisting, stop remembering. In our time, this manifests in quieter ways. We scroll through feeds designed to reinforce our existing beliefs, surrounded by algorithmic mirrors that reflect back our preferences until our world becomes a comfortable echo chamber. The daily practice of truth means occasionally seeking out perspectives that challenge us. It means pausing before sharing that inflammatory headline to ask, what do I actually know about this? What am I assuming? It means, when someone disagrees with us, resisting the instinct to immediately defend and instead asking, what might they be seeing that I'm missing? Truth as a practice also means what we might call precision in speech, that humble commitment to saying what we mean and meaning what we say. Orwell understood how language shapes thought, how newspeak wasn't just about controlling expression, but about limiting the very possibility of certain thoughts. In our daily lives, we can counter this by practicing exactness in our communication. When we say always or never, do we really mean those absolute terms? When we describe our feelings or experiences, can we find words that capture nuance rather than rushing to the first convenient label? This isn't about perfection. Orwell himself struggled with the tension between clarity and compassion. Rather, it's about cultivating what we might call intellectual humility, that willingness to say, I don't know, or I might be wrong about this. In our social media age, where opinions are currency and certainty is rewarded, this gentle practice of intellectual honesty becomes a radical act of resistance against the forces that prefer us simplified, predictable, easily managed. Perhaps most importantly, truth as a daily practice means what we might call attentive listening, that rare skill of truly hearing what others are saying without immediately translating their words through the filter of our own assumptions. In our polarized world, where political discourse has become warfare and every conversation feels like a battleground, this practice feels almost revolutionary. But it's precisely in these moments that Orwell's wisdom becomes most relevant. Totalitarian systems flourish when people stop trying to understand each other and start trying to defeat each other. The daily practice of truth asks us to resist this momentum toward simplification and instead practice the more difficult work of complexity, acknowledging that most important questions don't have simple answers, that good people can disagree profoundly, that understanding someone doesn't require agreeing with them. In this quiet practice of honesty with ourselves and others, we find not just clarity of thought, but a kind of peace. the deep satisfaction that comes from living in alignment with reality, however complex and uncomfortable that reality might be. For in the end, truth is not something we possess, but something we practice. And in that practice, we discover the freedom that Orwell fought to preserve, the freedom to see clearly, to think independently, and to choose each day, to align our lives with what is real and good and true. Let this thought settle gently as we approach Winston's final moments. Winston's final moments remind us that freedom is fragile but worth tending. In those last pages of 1984, as Winston sits beneath the chestnut tree in the Ministry of Love courtyard, we witness something both heartbreaking and profoundly hopeful. His mind has been broken, his spirit crushed, yet something essential remains. Orwell suggests that even in our darkest moments, there exists within us an awareness that observes our condition. This awareness, this inner witness, becomes our final sanctuary. Modern psychology has validated what Orwell intuited through his fiction. Research in trauma resilience shows us that individuals who maintain what psychologists call psychological flexibility, the ability to observe their thoughts and feelings without being completely consumed by them, demonstrate remarkable capacity for recovery, even from severe psychological oppression. This mirrors Orwell's insight that awareness itself becomes a form of resistance. When we learn to step back from the relentless pressure of external narratives, whether they come from authoritarian governments, social media algorithms, or our own anxious thoughts, we create space for truth to emerge. The practice is simple, yet profound, noticing without immediately judging, observing without immediately reacting. In our current digital age, where information flows faster than ever and attention becomes a scarce resource, Orwell's warnings feel remarkably prescient. We face subtler forms of doublethink, the careful curation of our social media personas, the way news algorithms feed us only what confirms our existing beliefs, the constant pressure to present our lives in perfect, filtered fragments. Yet within this complexity, the same ancient human capacity for inner freedom persists. Mindfulness practices, developed independently but aligned with Orwell's insights, offer us tools for navigating this psychological landscape. The simple act of breathing consciously, of noticing the present moment without immediately categorizing it as good or bad, becomes an act of reclaiming our inner sovereignty. This quiet work of freedom, this gentle tending to our inner spaciousness, does not require grand gestures or dramatic resistance. It happens in the spaces between our thoughts, in the pause before we react to triggers, in the choice to examine rather than immediately accept every narrative presented to us. Orwell understood that the most profound revolutions often occur not in the streets, but in the quiet corners of individual consciousness. When we cultivate this inner awareness, we discover that even amid external constraints, we retain the capacity to choose how we respond, to maintain our essential humanity, to preserve what the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas called the face of the other. Our capacity for genuine connection and compassion even when systems try to reduce us to mere functions. This is freedom's deepest mystery, that it flourishes not through grand proclamation, but through the simple, daily act of remaining awake to our own experience. Let this understanding rest with you as we approach our final reflection. What if the most powerful resistance is simply staying awake to reality? This question that George Orwell leaves us with, perhaps his greatest gift, is disarmingly simple, yet profoundly transformative. In a world that constantly whispers, "Sleep now, dream with us," Orwell suggests that consciousness itself becomes an act of courage, not the loud, dramatic kind that makes headlines, but the quiet, persistent vigilance of attention that preserves what makes us essentially human. Orwell's legacy invites us to cultivate what we might call contemplative clarity, a state of mind where we remain present to truth, even when convenience or comfort beckons us toward comfortable illusions. In our contemporary landscape, this takes on new dimensions. Social media algorithms that feed us information designed to confirm our existing beliefs, news cycles that blur the line between fact and opinion, political discourse that increasingly relies on emotional manipulation rather than reasoned argument, all of these create what Orwell would recognize as modern variations on his newspeak and doublethink. Yet the response remains unchanged, gentle, patient attention to reality. Consider how this gentle vigilance operates in daily life. When we encounter information that challenges our worldview, rather than immediately rejecting it or accepting it wholesale, we pause. We ask, what is the source? What evidence supports this claim? What might I be missing? This is not cynicism. It is intellectual humility wrapped in loving attention to truth. In relationships, it means listening with the whole self, noticing when our minds wander to preparing our response rather than truly hearing the other person. Each moment of present moment awareness becomes a small rebellion against the forces that would have us sleepwalk through our lives. The beautiful paradox that Orwell offers us is that this way of staying awake, attentive, careful, deliberate, is simultaneously the most modest and most revolutionary act we can perform. It requires no grand gestures, no public declarations, no conflict with others. It simply requires the commitment to remain conscious, to stay connected to reality rather than retreat into comfortable fantasies. In this practice, we become living testimonies to the possibility of truth in a world that profits from confusion, dignity in a culture that often degrades the human spirit, and hope in circumstances that might otherwise breed despair. This is not passive acceptance. It is active love expressed through sustained attention. And so, as our journey through Orwell's vision of human freedom draws to a peaceful close, we carry forward not the weight of dystopian warnings, but the lightness of liberation itself. The quiet commitment to truth that Orwell championed becomes our own gentle vigil, a daily practice of staying awake to reality with love, attention, and hope. In this simple commitment lies the seeds of a world where freedom and dignity can flourish, one conscious moment at a time. Tonight, as you rest, let these insights settle into your consciousness like gentle rain on fertile soil. Consider the simple acts of resistance available to you tomorrow. The pause before reacting, the question asked with genuine curiosity, the moment of silence claimed from the noise, the word chosen with care. These are not small things. They are the foundation of freedom itself. Orwell spent his life warning us about the shadows that threaten human dignity. But he also showed us the light, the inextinguishable flame of consciousness that no external power can completely control. As the night deepens and sleep approaches, carry with you this final truth, that in remaining awake to reality, in choosing clarity over comfort, in practicing truth as a daily discipline, you honor not only Orwell's legacy, but the deepest possibilities of your own humanity. May you find peace in this awareness. May you cultivate the gentle strength to see clearly, think independently, and live authentically. And may you discover, as Orwell did, that the simplest acts of consciousness become the most profound expressions of freedom. Let these thoughts rest with you now, quietly preparing your mind for peaceful dreams and tomorrow's gentle awakening to a world where truth still matters, where clarity still guides, and where one conscious soul can still make all the difference. Good night.